Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for the first event in our new series, Wait, You Collect What? Where we'll dive into specialty collections that give some of our institutions unique challenges in the museum world. My name is Beth Sanders, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Registrars Committee Western Region. RCWR has some wonderful sponsors. So quickly, just a thank to highlight Artwork Fine Art Services, one of our Tier 1 sponsors. For nearly 30 years, Artwork Fine Art Services has served as the trusted logistics partner of some of America's most highly recognized museums, art galleries, collectors, and artists. They specialize in expert handling and work passionately and painstakingly to customize unique and creative solutions for door-to-door domestic and international shipping, warehousing, and preservation of your artwork. With offices in Portland and Seattle, super convenient for many of our RCWR members. Be sure to speak with them for your upcoming shipping, packing, storage, and installation needs. If you're not a member of RCWR, please consider joining today. We represent collections professionals across all different types of institutions and collections, but within the 9 Western region states listed here. In addition to webinar series like this one, we also send out job listings, which will become more frequent again now that we have a brand new website and email distribution host, so that's exciting for us. But we also have stipends and in-person events and an amazing quarterly newsletter that you can take a look at on our website if you haven't seen it already. So at just $15 a year, it's a great deal to support an organization. Even if you don't live in our region and you want to support us, $15 a year, rcwr.org. Before I introduce our speakers, just a few quick logistics. As I mentioned, we are recording today's program and we'll be sharing it afterwards on our RCWR YouTube page. It takes a couple days for us to get it post-process it up, but so you'll be able to share it with all the people you know that would have benefited from being here today and didn't plan their schedules correctly. But that said, this is a meeting format, so everyone has the option of having their camera on or off. If you don't want your camera in that recording, even possibility of it, just go ahead and turn that off. And then also another note that everyone's mic is muted when they log in, and it'd be great if we keep it that way while our presenters are introducing themselves and their work, but then we'll have time for questions later. So don't hesitate later on when we get to that point to unmute yourself and actually ask the question. But if you have questions throughout, you can also put them in the chat. And I'll then moderate them to our presenters. We have 3 incredible presenters with us today who cover the gamut of living collections in Portland, Oregon, and can give us a really good sense of how botanical gardens and zoos and herbaria are making waves in museums collections management and the differences that these collections have to the ones we're used to talking about in our RCWR program. So this is really exciting, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Mandy Tu, Seth, Menser, and Rachel Burlington for joining us here today. I'll introduce Rachel, who will be our presenter moderator for the day, and then she can go on and introduce our other 2 speakers. So Rachel is the curator of the Portland Rose Garden in Portland, Oregon. She has a degree in ornamental horticulture with an emphasis on floriculture and has worked with rose and floral arboretum collections for over a decade. Her passion for roses led her to the International Rose Test Garden, where she works with both new varietals and pushes for the best management of their collection of over 10,000 roses, which is pretty impressive. So since someone can manage 10,000 roses, she can clearly manage taking over the screen here, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you so much for the opportunity to let me talk about plants. I know it's something we love doing, and so I'm very excited to share. So let me share the screen. Okay, looks like we got it. So from the beginning. Oops, there we go. And then let me just do one thing. Sorry about that. Not sure where my notes went. Okay, there we go. Do you see the presenter view on this screen?
We do not see a nose field. Looks good.
All right, cool. All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all for coming. So this is my
My name is Rachel Burlington, and I'm joined by Seth Menser, horticulture manager at Oregon Zoo, and Dr. Mandy Tu, the herbarium curator at Hoyt Arboretum. And so we all work together in what's called a greater Washington Park, and Washington Park has several different institutions within that park. And so we have the Oregon Zoo, the Rose Garden, and Hoyt Arboretum all in one area. So we work together, but we're in separate sites. Before we get started, I just want to kind of talk about, I had some of my happiest memories growing up at museums, and I was always amazed just how much care they took to interpret it and tell a story that made abstract things seem relatable and easier to understand. So even though I chose botany as my preferred field and my discipline, it's natural that I gravitated towards the type of botany that was more curatorial based and collection based. And plant collections make the abstract principles of plant science more organized and attainable for research and for public education. And plant collections are virtually unknown to the masses, but they have such a rich and diverse field with a wide array of interesting specialties. So even within plant collections, there are so many specialized plant collections, and you'll hear about several of them today with an herbarium with Dr. Mandy Tu and a zoo collection with Seth Menser. So let's get started. Before we talk about what a plant collection is, let's talk about what are the institutions that have these collections. And most of them are public gardens. What are public gardens? And I am pulling this really good definition from the website of American Public Gardens Association. That is our professional organization that manages and develops garden. Their mission is a world where public gardens are indispensable. And I think that's a really wonderful mission, and one that you can remember, because I did that without notes. And so public gardens, they actually work with American Lions and Museums as well. So they work hand in hand with the museum industry. In fact, our president did the advocacy day. I think that was just like last week or 2 weeks ago. So, a lot of crossover between public gardens and, what you folks do. And so I guess, so I'm just going to read this definition because it is really well put. It is an institution that maintains a collection of plants for the purpose of public education and enjoyment, in addition to research, conservation, and higher learning. It must be open to the public, and the garden's resources and accommodations must be made to all visitors. So it has a maintained collection, and it's open to the public, because there are a lot of private gardens that have nice plant collections that aren't access to the public. Because there's a lot of private collections, and sometimes public gardens are the benefactors of that. So we know what the definition are, but where are they in practice? And they're very diverse. We have zoos. We have public parks, and that's where I work. We have cemeteries. Cemeteries are really cool because before we had parks, people would hang out in cemeteries because that was like a shared public space. So there's a lot of good collections, a lot of interesting plants in cemeteries. They're universities, they're private estates, Arboretum, which is Hoyt Arboretum, historic houses, etc. I also want to note that sometimes there are some plant collections alongside other more permanent collections. For example, I used to work at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is mainly known for post-impressionist art. And it also has a rare collection of rare trees. So a lesser known. So a lot of these plant collections, are in conjunction with other collections. And there are over 3,000 worldwide, and that is that's quite remarkable. I think every major city has at least one. So we found out who has living collections. Let's talk about what are living collection. And the easy way of saying it, it's your collection includes things that are alive. So plants are alive, they're dynamic, they respond to their environmental factors, and there's a zoological collection. I mean, that's aside from plants as well, but that's not my area of expertise. So I'm just going to mention that. So plant collections, what makes it different than just having a garden in your house is, or even in a public park, you might have some plants in a public park, but it might not necessarily be part of a collection. Plant collections are accessioned and a records and inventory process is maintained. Collections have a defined purpose and help fulfills the mission of the institution. So every collection needs to have a purpose, even if the purpose is it's pretty. That is, that's its value. And then you have more specialized ones like conservation, like that you're growing certain water plants that are drought tolerant because you want to preserve them. As the climate is changing, we want to be mindful of what plants we can grow, and public gardens helps with that. And one thing I wanted to note is the kind of the vernacular of our trade. This is a registrar organization, and I think our equivalent at public gardens are referred to as plant recorder. And I might be misunderstanding that, but that generally reports to the collections curator, and then they maintain the inventory. They do a lot of what you do, but with plant records. And some large institutions and public gardens have a curator, and some of the really big ones, for example, Longwood Gardens have collection. They each have curators for different collections. Like you might have the woody plant collection, which are like trees and shrubs, anything with like a permanent woody structure, or the herbaceous, which is this plant Gaillardia is an example of herbaceous. And so that's something that dives back down to the ground. Or if you're in small institution, you're the curator / volunteer coordinator / horticulture manager / everything else. So it can range a lot about these roles. And I know an important part of collections is the source of it, because that tells a story. That's good information. So plant collections these are a few examples of how we get our collections. Some of them, pretty straightforward. Plant nurseries trade. We want to develop a collection and we see if they are available in any of the nurseries that are nearby. Maybe it's not like a rare collection. Maybe we just want to highlight camellias and we see what camellias are available. We also we trade with other public gardens. That is the nice thing about having permanent specimens that can be propagated. In the museum world, you can loan out your objects for special to other organizations. We can't do that because it's very permanent. But the nice thing is we can get propagations from plant material that we might like or need to fulfill a certain collection goal. And in fact, it's probably a good practice to do that, because if something happens to their specimen, they know that they gave us a cutting, they can then come back. So it's like a way of backing up your collection. And another way of sourcing it is wild collecting, and that can be regional, local, national, international. And Seth here has done extensive work doing wild collections, so I will certainly let him talk about that more, but just wanted to briefly mention it. And a lot of the collections are state gifts. A lot of the botanic gardens were people's private homes that turned to a public garden as they passed away and it got opened up to the public. So a lot of them it's just amazing how many private collections have such a wealth of botanical treasures. And then once you source your material and you plant it, there are different ways to label it. And this is probably one of the challenges, and I'll talk about the challenges in a minute. But here are some examples. The one on the tree, it's quite literally screwed into it, because how else are you going to create a more permanent labeling system. You could just put one stake in the ground, but like the second one, because that's a stake that gets pushed in. That's actually in a pot. And that is, it talks a little bit about the plant. And actually, let me go over about what is on the label. So you have the scientific name, you have the genus, and then, which is the first word, and then the specific epithet. So within that genus, what is that specific species? And then actually, I'm going to be referring to the middle label, just so you have reference. The second line is the common name. And there's certainly a lot of things wrong with common names. We could talk about that all day. But it's good to include that because that's usually what people know things as. And then this third level, there is the family. And then the fourth line is where it's native to. So that's important to talk about where plants are native. I think that's part of the education. And this one here is an epiphytic plant. So that is a plant, it talks a little bit about it, that physically needs to attach to another plant to survive. It's not parasitic where you're, it's not getting nutrients from the plant, but it's just using that other plant for physical support. And this label is from Maurice Shelby Garden. And so it is a good example of how to have some educational value to that. And then the third labels are just another example of how one uses QR codes, multiple ways of communicating. And I think those QR codes links to a fact sheet. This was actually done, I helped curate a collection at a cemetery in Philadelphia called Laurel Hill Cemetery. And so those are the labels for that. Challenges of living collections. The really obvious one is the changing climate. Your collections strategy might change based, in 5 years because you can't grow what you used to. I know there is some botanic gardens that are actually modeling out what the climate will look in a couple of decades. And then they're basing their collection strategy on what plants can grow in that time period. So there's a lot of forward thinking, a lot of interesting modeling is going on for these botanic gardens, because even here in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, people are starting to plant New Zealand plants a lot, and just thinking that they're a lot more drought tolerant, and that might be a reality, in the not so distant future. So that is some problems. Your collections are going to be changing. And I think it's the bigger issue is if you're known for a certain genus or types of plants, you might not be able to grow those. So you have to kind of reinvent yourself. Risk of natural disasters, vandalism, not all gardens are gated. So you have people that can destroy your collection. And unfortunately, there's not much you can do about that if you don't have a gated property. And natural disasters, I know Ambler Arboretum in Philadelphia, they actually, they lost some of their specimen trees due to a tornado. So it is a real factor having to deal with that. Can you imagine like a 30-year collection being gone overnight? It's challenging. The good thing is you just rebuild and plant, but here's the third one that's not so obvious is effective accessioning with accurate identification. It is so hard to keep track of plants that move around, and like you can't put a label on them because they either die back to the ground or the label can't really stand up to the elements. So you have to have another system of cataloging and making sure that if that label goes away, you can still reconcile that plant name. So that is something I'm struggling with at the Rose Garden. I had all these accession tags, and they're just, I'm just gonna have to find a new way other than adding tags to them because they just get destroyed in the elements. Plant health. So you literally have to keep your collection can die if you aren't maintaining it. So you have to work with the climate. You have to work with all sorts of weather. And I mean, certainly that's the reality of it. And you have to balance that plant health with the public use, because I know a lot of these public gardens, which is actually a really good segue into my next slide. A lot of public gardens, life happens here. There's events, that's certainly a revenue stream, but also you just want people in the doors. You want people to just get excited about plants. And the way to do it is to open up your doors and be welcoming. Like, you need to meet them where you're at. You need to meet them where they're at. And so there is that public element. I have to say, someone had a pink poodle in the rose garden. So I had in front of a pink rose, I just had to snap a picture. So, and I just that's what I love about these spaces. Life happens in them, but you also have to maintain the integrity of your plant material and your collection. There's a Chihuly exhibit here in Denver Botanic Gardens. That's the one up top, the linear one. And then actually this is a Hoyt Arboretum, a wedding. So beautiful space there. Let's see. And then I wanted to talk about this briefly. The Plant Collections Network is in a collection accreditation program that is through American Public Gardens Association. So you can accredit your collection, excuse me. And hold on, I'm going back. Here we go. You want to accredit your collection. And of course, there's a whole criteria that I'm not going to go over, but what's really cool is I wanted to highlight some collections because it just shows how diverse. So you see this little pod here, that is actually a seed bank that is actually an accredited collection. So that is at the Boyce Thompson Arboretum in Superior, Arizona. And this actually is a Fabiaceae. So that is the legume family. And the seed-based collection has 1,454 taxa is housed at University of Tucson, and 206 of the plants are grown at the Arboretum. So it kind of shows a cool partnership of a collection, and that a collection can be genus-based, which a lot of these are, but it also could be seeds. It can be a whole family. So they're pretty imaginative about what is a collection. And a few other ones that are highlighted is clematis that is a Rogerson clematis garden in Westland, Oregon. That is the purple flower. And then the Cornus collection in Cheekwood, Tennessee. And there's 326 individual and 14 different species and 7 hybrids. So quite extensive. And then this opens up the ability to trade with each other. It gives scientific credibility to your collection. So there's a lot of reasons to participate. Speaking of big collections, let's talk about the Rose Garden. So I am the curator for the Rose Garden, and Seth here actually hired me. So he's my former boss, but he has moved on to the zoo, and I got hired about 6 years ago, and we have over 10,000 rose specimens and 631 different varieties. So you might have heard Mr. Lincoln, that would be a variety. Peace is another variety, just to give you an example. And so we have so many diverse roses. In fact, people are like, I didn't even know a rose looked like this. We have stripes, we have little ones. It is a very diverse collection. And I want to touch on the mission a bit because I think it's very unique. So our mission, it's a test garden. So what does test mean? So about 95% of the collection is provisional, auditioning for permanent status in the garden. We are testing them as they become less commercially viable. We take out the variety and we replace it with a new one on the market. And we work with rose breeders. We work with rose companies, and they give us their new roses, even sometimes before they're released. So, and if those roses are good, I nominate them for to be considered for an award called the Gold Medal Award. And if it wins that Gold Medal Award, then it receives permanent status in the collection, the Gold Medal collection. So we have a really nice blend of historical varieties from like 100 years ago and brand new roses that you can't eat, that aren't even on the market right now. And that mission is to showcase new roses. We are the city of roses, so it ties in nicely. And so that is kind of an example of a specialty collection. And so it really truly is an interesting system. And I think what's really cool is it's over 100 years old, and it's been continuously operating on that mission since the beginning. So even though the roses have changed, what we do with them has pretty much stayed the same. Okay, thank you, everyone. This is concludes the bit for the Rose Garden, and I'm going to turn it over to Seth Menser, who is going to speak to us about zoo collections and wild collecting. So thank you, Seth, for being here.
Yep, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Seth Menser. I do work up here at the Oregon Zoo, and I've worked in zoos for a long time. And I also was the Washington Park supervisor before I came down here to the zoo. So I did hire Rachel, which was a great hire, and I got to work with Mandy as part of Hoyt Arboretum. Hoyt Arboretum was also part of that group here in Washington Park. So yeah, so, and I should tell you that before I worked at Washington Park, before the zoo, I worked at the San Diego Zoo for over 10 years. And that's where I've got most of my experience with collecting and plant accreditation. So I have a lot of experience with the plant accreditation and also with collecting. And I'll say a zoo is very unique because zoo has both animal collections and plant collections in one place concentrated in. And both of them kind of interact. We also provide some of our collection plants for food for the animals. And the picture on the left that you see here is actually a story of a plant, a success story of a small stick insect that was thought to be extinct. And it was found by some researchers on Lord Howe Island or off the coast about 20 years ago. They thought it was extinct. They found a few breeding pairs. They brought them back to the mainland, started having success with that. San Diego Zoo got some of the eggs and we started raising them, and we came to the conclusion that we needed actually some browse for them, that what we call browse, which is food for them. And when they're small, and I actually have a tiny little stick insect here to show you, they're called tree lobsters, pretty neat insect. Well, when they're young and they're in their small instar stage, they can only eat the plant that you see on the left, which is a Melaleuca howiana. When they get older, they eat ficus, which we had plenty of in San Diego, but we did not have that Melaleuca howiana in the United States. So that was an opportunity to go over to Australia and to collect them. And I had a lot of experience of collecting in Australia. And this was just one of the collection trips. I think the slide's going to come back up. I'm hearing. But anyways, so it was a success story in that we found the browse for that insect, and they were able to eat it. And then when they got a little bit older and more mature, that we could feed them ficus successfully. So the reason the ficus part of it. So first of all, I should say the San Diego Zoo has 7 accredited plant collections: palm, cycads, ficus, coral, which is erythrina, orchids, acacia, and bamboo. And I oversaw the ficus collection. And the ficus was very special in a zoo-like setting because it's a huge browse plant, plants that we could feed to the animals successfully, part of their diet. And so I had a lot of support in going overseas, collecting new species, and bringing them into our collection, growing them, because whenever we would trim them or anything, we could feed them to the animals. And that was a real neat opportunity to do. And I had the support of that. By the time I left after 10 years, I think that we had about 130 species of ficus. And as far as I could tell, it was the largest accredited ficus collection in the world. So I was really proud of that. I'm a native Oregonian, so I wanted to come back home. And so that's how I ended up here in Oregon. I oversaw the ficus collection and throughout my time there. And here in Oregon, we can actually grow about 5, which we grow as well. But you really need a climate like San Diego. It's more conducive to growing these tropical plants. I think she's gonna pull is the slide gonna come back up?
We've lost Rachel for the moment. She dropped off, but I'm trying.
That's fine. I'll keep talking. So anyways, I was able to do, and I should go back to that Melaleuca, the little plant that I showed you that we did for browse. So all of our plants that we collected were accredited, which we would track down, give it a number. Even if it didn't fall within those 7 accredited plant collections, we still tracked it all. And so there was a tremendous amount of work that went into, like Rachel said, recording the location, the history of it. Obviously, if you have wild collected stuff, it makes it a lot more valuable, a lot more of a resource for people to share. And I think Mandy will probably touch on this as well. So being able to go into the wild to collect these plants, of course, there's a lot of permits that are required. You need to get permission. So I had a lot of support to go to Australia to do that. I got to go to Australia, I think 8 times, 8 collecting trips. I've also been able to collect in New Zealand, New Caledonia, Hawaii, the Bahamas, and definitely in California as well, and northern Mexico. So I had a lot of experience of collecting those. There we go. All right, so anyways, I wanted to show you, because Australia is such a diverse country. It's larger than the size of the United States, the continental United States. It's huge. There's different ecosystems. The picture on the right is where baobab trees come from. People don't realize the baobab trees, a species of baobab tree, is native to Australia, and this was in Western Australia, the upper left-hand corner, if you were to look at a map of Australia. And maybe the next slide, please. Yeah, so and also Australia has tons of rainforest and eucalyptus woodlands. So on the left is Cape York, which you can see I'm standing next to scientists. You're at the northernmost tip of Australia. So that is actually, if you were to look on the right side, the little finger that goes all the way up, that comes 70 miles from Papua New Guinea. So a lot of the flora in that area is similar to Papua New Guinea. So I got to collect a lot of plants up there, more of the tropical figs. And in fact, we discovered a species of ficus that had never been known. And Mandy actually holds the herbarium sample up at Hoyt Arboretum, which is really neat. So someday we'll be able to, when we have time, if we ever have time, we'll be able to work a lot more on naming that and describing that species. So yes, ficus was my specialty. I'm still involved in it as well. But one of the things that we did do with our collections, as far as educating the public, just an example, is we would make a lot of brochures, flyers. Here's one on the ficus as well. We did one for every collection to really highlight the collections we have, because as you guys know, accreditation, it's much like artwork in a museum. And so we were really proud on doing all that work to accreditate the plant collection. Rachel had made up a really good point about plants move, they disappear, they go around. One of the ways that we track plants, and we track plants here at the Oregon Zoo, is we make a grid of our campus. We try and put on the location where the plants, we track everything that's coming in, planting, location. A next step, which we did at the San Diego Zoo, was actually GPS locations. And so with like a cycad collection where you have hundreds of small little cycads that are small, it was really impossible to tell what is where. And I agree, the labels, they fly out, they go away. But with a GPS location, it seems to help really keep track of those things on smaller plants. We also had an orchid collection, which you can imagine, orchids are really small. We had them in a greenhouse, couldn't GPS those, but we had a whole tracking system for that as well. So that is kind of my spiel about plant collections. Here at the Oregon Zoo, we are trying to incorporate the tracking of the animal collection with software that's integrated into the plant collection. So that's something we're actively working on. There's a lot of, like I said, spillover between some of the accredited plants. We'll also feed some of the accredited animals. So a zoo world is very unique in that you kind of have multiple collections, accredited collections, but then you also have a ton of people come in, and so there's a lot of moving parts in a zoo, I will say. And yeah, that's kind of my spiel on that. I know that Mandy Tu, and really excited to work when I first came back to Oregon, overseeing Washington Park and Hoyt Arboretum and the Rose Garden. And Rachel was one of the best hires I did. So it's great to see her still going strong in the Rose Garden. And I'm going to give a plug to Hoyt Arboretum because Mandy's talking up next, because Hoyt Arboretum is just a real jewel of Portland. It's over 90 years old, almost 100 years old. Beautiful, beautiful tree collection. And they do really, really great work up there. It's only about a half mile here from the zoo, so I still get to see them a lot. Yeah, so that's what I have on my plant collecting and accreditation at a zoo. And with that promotion of Hoyt Arboretum, I think I'll pass it over to Mandy.
Great, thank you very much, Seth. Let's go to our next slide, Rachel. You don't mind? Great, thank you for having me. Again, my name is Mandy Tu, and I'm the plant curator, plant taxonomist actually, and herbarium curator for the Hoyt Arboretum. And I thought I'd first spend a minute talking about the Arboretum in general, and then talk about one part of our Arboretum collection that many of you may not be familiar with. So first off, let's talk a little bit about Hoyt Arboretum. Next slide, Rachel. So the Arboretum is a public garden, which is a museum of living trees. So this is a living collection. And as Seth mentioned, we are over 90 years old. It was founded, I believe, in 1928. So we're actively working on our 100th anniversary coming up in a few years. We're considered sort of a medium-sized garden. We have about 100 to 200 acres in size and 12 miles of trails. A lot of folks in the Portland area and visitors like to come and just do walking and hiking. We have about 6,500 trees that we take care of at the Arboretum that encompasses over 2,000 different taxa from over 100 different families. And about 60 of those trees are on our IUCN Red List, which are considered globally threatened or vulnerable species. And so the overall mission or goal of the Arboretum is to have this living collection for public enjoyment as a wonderful space. We also provide a lot of education to kids as well as adults. And then we also have a very active conservation program with our endangered tree species. So that's the Arboretum in just a nutshell. But now I'd like to talk about the herbarium, which is this piece that a lot of people that are not really plant nerds know about. So next slide. All right, so an herbarium, this is what I am the curator for. So a plant herbarium is basically a plant reference library for dead plants. And so it's comprised of dried, flattened plant specimens, and they are documented in a specific way that provides proof that a plant existed at a given time and place. And so a lot of these old collections, the oldest herbaria, are from Europe, and they're over 400 years old. And also a lot of land-grant universities also have herbaria. And so basically herbaria are places where they store plant specimens that will tell you if a plant existed at a certain place and time. Next slide, please. And so the Hoyt Arboretum herbarium has a mission of basically documenting and verifying the plant species that we have in our Arboretum living collection. So Rachel talked a lot about knowing where our plants come from. And so it's important in our living collection to make sure that we have good provenance information saying where did those plants come from, but also to make sure that our collections have this scientific credibility. We also need to make sure that what species we have is indeed the plant that we say it is. And so we need to have actual proof or documentation of what those plants are. And so that's where having a museum of pressed and dried specimens, usually in a phenology, so this is at a growth stage that has these identifying characteristics. So for plants in flower or in fruit, or if you have a conifer, those with mature cones are really important to help you make sure that what species you have is what you say it has. And that further gives our living collection scientific validity. And so that's the focus of our herbarium, is to have specimens of our living collection. But then, since Hoyt Arboretum is also a City of Portland Park, we also have these specimen vouchers, or just vouchers, that are of significant value to us on a region-wide basis. And so we also have specimens of Portland heritage trees and unique street trees. And then my also area of interest is in exotic weeds in the region. So these are the things that we tend to focus on in the herbarium. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a lot of people want to know, when you're making herbarium specimens, how do you take something like a honkin' big tree, which is 3D, how do you make these into these flattened, dried specimens? And well, as I mentioned, we collect pieces of those plants at these unique stages. Next slide, please. And there's at least a 12-step process for making these specimens. So first off, I collect them, and then they're pressed in a plant press, and then they're stuck in the dryer, and then we have to change newspapers to make sure they don't mold. And then after they're properly dried, then they're identified to species, and they're verified using their native floras and online floras, and compared with online herbarium specimens to make sure that we have the correct species. Then we enter that information in the database, and then finally I have volunteers that help me take those dried plant pieces, like this one right here. Oh, you can't see it. Oh, well, it's kind of fuzzy. Okay, so you have these dried plant pieces that are then mounted on archival paper with the correct label. And then after we do all of that affixation to the paper, then we freeze everything to kill off all the bugs. And then I have another set of wonderful volunteers that come and take photos and image everything. And then we finally put them into our metal cabinets. So there's a multi-step process for how we make and document our herbarium specimens. Next slide. And then we also try to make that observation information available to others. And so, for instance, we have our internal database that we use, the Hoyt Arboretum Garden Explorer, which then is also accessible to others that want to see specimens online. But then all of our data is also shared in one of our regional data nodes called the Consortium of Pacific Northwest Herbaria, which has, I think, 80 different member herbaria across the Pacific Northwest. This one is run through the University of Washington, and so they have specimen data from across all Northwest states and areas. And they have over 3 million specimens in their database. So then you can look up, where have species been documented? Are there images associated with that? And that's just a really important resource for not only people that work in herbaria like myself, but also for people who study conservation and plant ecologists and things like that. So we're all about, you know, making a wonderful, beautiful arboretum for people to come and enjoy the place, but also we're very involved and engaged in furthering conservation of plants and trees in particular. And the herbarium is one piece of that that helps make sure that our living collection has that scientific credibility. Okay, last slide. And so in conclusion, for those of you that were not familiar with what an herbarium is, again, it is a museum of dry pressed dead plants that works to verify and voucher our living plant collection. And basically, it adds scientific credibility to the Arboretum and to our accredited collections. We work to function as a center of plant expertise for the city of Portland and our partners. And it's also just a fun place to visit where you can come and have a walk and see beautiful sights. Okay, I think that's all that I had planned for today. Are we going to have questions now?
Yes.
Yes.
I'll go
So
ahead and
I'll stop
put my
sharing.
screen back up so that all of our presenters' contact information is available. So if at any time you want their email address, you screenshot right there. Did you want me to start sending you questions, Rachel?
Sure, absolutely. I think we have like, what, 10 minutes? So,
We do.
yes, okay, cool. Yep, fire away.
So we had a question about what type of education and training is required to have your positions. And then another person asked just now how much specialized plant and animal knowledge you need to work with the living collections.
All right. Well, I'll start with mine. So at Hoyt Arboretum, we have a curator for the entire Arboretum, and his name is Martin. And let me see, and I think he has worked in the nursery and plant trade for decades. I think he has a master's from Oregon State in horticulture or maybe forestry. And he has a lot of experience taking care of the plants themselves. I don't have that experience taking care of plants. So I have an undergrad degree in botany from University of Washington, and I have a PhD in plant biology from University of California at Davis. And honestly, in school, we didn't really learn about taking care of herbarium collections. But as an undergraduate at UW, I volunteered in the herbarium because it was a fun thing to do. And then in graduate school, I did a lot of work with my doctoral work, as well as when I was a teaching assistant, I did a lot of work in the herbarium. And then I also had a separate side job working as a graduate student assistant at the California Department Food and Ag herbarium. But it's mostly self-taught through, student internships and just being in herbaria and learning how to do that work itself. And I don't think you need the advanced degree to work in an herbarium, not at all. But I think it does help with the experience and learning how to use the plant keys and learning, like what makes a good reference and things like that. I don't know if I totally answered that question.
Mandy, you have a lot of knowledge of botanical terms, like peduncle, things
Yeah.
like that. So very specialized. I think that is a very
Yeah, and I think that comes from more experience working through plant keys and also teaching plant taxonomy at the college level, but it doesn't have to do with having that degree. It was more teaching plant taxonomy and then working as a botanist.
I wanted to chime in on the value of herbariums, because I can tell you a lot of plant collecting trips, like you go into these parts of Australia that are just untouched. The first place you always want to go to is trying to go to an herbarium to see what has been found there in that area. And it gives you a lot of clues, even if they're 100 years old, as to, okay, well, in this area, this was found in this area. So it's a really good guide for people who are collecting or looking for IUCN red listed plants. To go to the herbarium first, it's going to give you your best clues, better than anything really on the internet, although most herbariums are on the internet now, but is a really valuable resource for historical purposes, but also just for collecting and knowing what's in an area, especially in very remote areas. So I know that I have visited many herbariums, not many, but a handful in Australia, and it's been really helpful to find out, save you time of where to go, in a huge country. So a lot of value in that.
We just got a question from Keith in the chat, which I think many museum institutions can relate to, that they work in institutions that have herbariums that have gone unmanaged for some
Yeah.
years. I know I've had herbarium collections and no herbarium expertise for
Mhm.
myself in institutions I've worked at. So he's asking, what are some first steps they could take and to get familiar with the collection and start managing it again? And they're in British Columbia, so
Yeah.
should they look into registering it with the PNW?
Yeah, if you're in British Columbia, definitely reach out to the folks at UBC. I think it's the Beatty Museum at University of British Columbia. They have a huge herbaria, herbaria, plural. Yes, and they actually have a herbarium curator and people that work in that specifically. A big danger, a big threat to non-managed herbarium collections is just they get eaten by insects. And so unless they're actively managed and checked on, things that are just stored in boxes in a garage can get chomped on and eaten up by insect, and then your entire collection is gone. And so I would reach out to some folks at UBC and say your institution has these boxes or these collections. They'll want to know, how are they stored? What kind of condition are they in? Are the plants mounted on paper? Do they have good labels? Are they cataloged in any way? Or are they just dry plants with a newspaper without notes? And if that's the case, they're pretty much useless. But if they're actual already mounted specimens with labels, they will find a way to get them digitized and hopefully get them up to date. Because you don't want that information to just disappear.
A comment went into the chat from Meg Mooney reminding to protect yourself if the herbarium collection reeks already of mothballs, and if you have indication of past pesticide applications.
Yeah, so mothballs is the old way of controlling insects, which is the biggest threat to your herbarium specimens. Yeah, and so there is, some people still use them, and a lot of people are trying to get away from toxic chemicals. Our collection is small enough so that every cabinet that houses 1,000 to 100 to 1,500 specimens, I can freeze an entire cabinet all at once, and I cycle through and freeze the contents of all of our herbarium specimens every 6 months to a year to control our insects. But for larger institutions, they may use chemicals, they may use pheromone traps. Ones that are, institutions that are well funded have temperature control and keep their collections under almost like refrigerator temperatures, and that will control your insects.
What does IPM look like at institution with living collections?
Well, I'll speak for the Arboretum. So living collections, so we have a lot of threats from mostly insects, but also sometimes rusts or fungi and things like that. One of our big threats right now is emerald ash borer. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but this is a boring insect that specifically bores into and kills ash trees, and was just discovered in Oregon last summer and has been well known on the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic states, Midwest, for decades. So we are actively on the lookout for certain insect pests. As far as I know, we don't actively use a lot of insecticides on our trees, but we do use herbicides to kill off target weeds. And I think Rachel can talk more about IPM in the rose collection.
Yeah, the secret to roses is just learning how to deal with all the pests and diseases. They're so inbred, so there's a lot of fungal diseases. I feel like every insect loves roses. They're so beautiful. I mean, I don't blame them. So we have probably our biggest threat to roses is rose rosette disease and an insect called midge. And threat means like can kill it, because there's fungal diseases that might compromise the vigor of the plant, but not the actual, you know, it would still live basically. So the nice thing about the rose garden is we are a test garden. So what we're doing is we're actively trying to test for roses that have that ward off these diseases. And that is a formal testing area. And that is really, I'd say probably 300 roses out of 10,000 roses is the formal test roses. So it's not a huge bit. So the rest of the garden, the other, I don't know, 9,700 roses, we do chemically treat if we have to. And we have some insect midge, and we have been trying to work on some beneficial insects. So some lacewings, some parasitoid wasps to, you know, not, I mean, of course we have to use some chemicals, but we're trying to emphasize just especially because practically the restrictions on chemicals are just changing every day. So we have to be looking, we might not have these tools in the future to work with. And so we try to keep things as clean as possible, sanitation, keep the beds clean. So disease, particularly fungal diseases, do not spread easily. One thing I will say though, coming from the East Coast, we don't have the humidity created the climate, a much better climate for fungal diseases. So I have to say, just in general, in this climate, we just don't have to worry so much about the fungal diseases. I mean, the viruses and the insects are still an issue. So those are our biggest threat. And a lot of it's like physically removing damaged plant tissue. You know, it's a whole, like IPM literally stands for integrated pest management. Integrated meaning all these different tools are used. And so that's kind of an overview of how we deal with that.
Melissa is wondering what type of collections management system or database you're using to manage the different types of living and formerly living collections. And then she also has a follow-up wondering if any of you work with seed banks as part of your collections management, which I think really ties into what you mentioned earlier about loans, giving some to other institutions as a way of preserving and backing up your collection.
Yeah, I can start on that part. We use an internal to us, we use a program called Iris BG, Iris Botanic Garden, which is a database specific for botanic gardens for living collections. It was developed in Europe, and we pay a yearly license fee that we share with Leach Botanic Garden and with the Rose Garden, although Rachel is trying out a couple of different systems right now. And we also run our herbarium specimens through the same database. And so all of our collections in the herbarium from our living collection trees are tied specifically to each of our accessioned tree items. And there's pros and cons to it. It's not the easiest to use for herbarium specific things. For instance, printing out labels is not as easy as I think it should be, but it's the system that we use and it works for us right now. And it's called Iris BG. And then as far as seed banks, we do not, to my knowledge, house any specific seed banks ourselves, but we have definitely collected seed and sent them to other partners who manage seed banks. For instance, we've done collections off of some of our ash trees and sent those seed off. We have a very large and diverse conifer collection that we also collect a lot of seed and send to partners for them to grow out or for storage.
And I'll chime in here because the zoo setting is really unique, in which we use a program for the animal collection as ZIMS. And recently ZIMS bought out Hortus, which was a spinoff of Iris BG. And so that's what we're working on right now, is combining the ZIMS animal collection management system with the Hortus so that it's all integrated. We do have a registrar who does all the animal stuff. I know before, when I was at San Diego Zoo, we had a plant registrar who would do without it. So our long-term plan is to have a registrar for plants and for animals and combine both software so that it's all integrated.
Wow.
Nick is wondering, Rachel, has the size of the rose garden changed over the years? Does growth in number of specimens affect accreditation?
That is a good question. So the rose garden has certainly changed. I think it started with 1,000, and it's really cool seeing historical roses 100 years ago. In size, so the short answer, yes, it has changed. I think we've just gotten to 10,000 only a couple of years ago. And before then it was kind of increasing by 1,000 or so each year. And when you speak of accreditation, we actually do not have that yet. That is something we're working on, is getting the accreditation. And that would be cultivar, because, it's all different, cultivars. And so the short answer is, I'm not sure if that will affect accreditation. I think if it's aligned with the mission, I think that it probably will still be a candidate for accreditation. So I'll stay tuned. Check back on the website, see if we get that accreditation. But that's something I'm working on right now.
How do you track quantity of plants, especially those that die annually, in your collection?
I'm working on something called the legacy collection, that as we remove roses and they die, there's still records available of what we have, because I think what we used to have also tells an important story. So the legacy collection is just former roses. Believe in Iris, there is a way to track deceased plants and removals. And so the session is still there.
Yeah. In Iris BG, our database program, when we have something that dies, there's a status field that we can choose, and so it will still show up on the list of, we had a certain plant at a certain time, and then it will say if it was not found, if it's now dead. You can enter in any comments about where it's at, about what happened to it or not. And then every single living collection accession also has a GPS point, so we know exactly where it is, and you can see it on the map that it prints out. So it has a lot of information, and definitely does track plants that have since died. And we don't keep track of any annuals. I don't think we have any annuals in our collection. So we just don't do that, but we do have several perennial herbaceous plants, but we're mostly shrubs and trees is our emphasis.
What does disaster planning look like for your different institutions? Something that us museum folks are always talking about, how we can be better prepared, especially in earthquake country, and what could be affecting our collections.
I'll chime in on this because I know this is something Rachel and I worked on, and it's something I worked on before, and it is setting up backup collections. I know Rachel, we went down to the Oregon Garden and wanted to set up a backup collection of all the important ones that in case we lost them at the Rose Garden, at least we would have a backup. And Rachel did talk about this a little bit, and I've done that before. That's kind of like, in my opinion, your best bet is to share it, because you're also sharing the material with other institutions. And also, in case you have construction project or some other reason that the plants are gone besides earthquakes or landslides at the Rose Garden, at least you have a resource to bring those back into the collection.
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate that I identified a certain number of specimens that would be virtually impossible to replace, and focused those. All the other ones, even though it would be a pain to bring back 10,000 roses, the availability is not an issue. So it would just be a resource issue, not a plausibility of doing it.
And with the software, you can also still have those as credited plants. They would just be in a different location.
It's really fascinating, the similarities to historical museum collections management, which is what I'm accustomed to, as well as art museums. That every museum's a little bit different, but like, yeah, we have our priority artifacts, the things that are the most unique in our collection, and that's what we focus on. Okay, in a disaster, how are we saving those items first before we get to the rest of the items? But we can't exactly put seeds of physical unique 3D items in a lone situation, so I'm kind of jealous of that. But I've found this conversation really fascinating, and I'm really grateful to the three of you for being willing to talk with us today. Is there anything else you wanted to add before? I know we're already a few minutes past the hour. If not, then a huge thank you to Rachel, Mandy, and Seth for being here, as well as for those of you who joined in and asked some great questions. And maybe you'll bring things back to herbarium collections in your historical collections, or perhaps you're collecting herbarium and plants regularly. Before I take it down, don't forget to take a screenshot of any of our contact information if you want to get in touch with us. You'll see my email address on the right side of the viewer screen if you have questions about the Registrars Committee Western Region, this series, or a really unique collection you think might be a good candidate for one of these. Definitely send me an email, but if you have questions about living or formerly living collections, those are your experts to go to. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us. Our next presentation will be in April, and it'll be Wait, You Collect What? Things that go boom. So a little bit of torpedoes and
cool.
other ordnance, as well as a side of some firearms. So we'll have some really great content there, and totally different specialty collection. Everything here will be recorded and we'll post it up on our YouTube page. So don't forget to check back if you've missed anything or share away. But thank you all so much. And with